Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kelly O'Donnell in Washington. The countdown is on to the biggest night left on the midterm primary calendar, with the spotlight squarely on the future of the Democratic Party as it navigates an escalating battle between insurgent progressives and more mainstream moderates. Primary voters head to the polls in a slate of key races tomorrow in battleground House districts across 5 states, governor's seats in Kansas and Michigan that Republicans are hoping to flip. And, of course, the night's marquee matchup, the Michigan Senate Democratic primary. That's where establishment-backed Congresswoman Haley Stevens is taking on progressive Abdul El-Sayed in a race that's put a spotlight on Democratic divisions, especially over the issue of U.S. support for Israel and the influence of the pro-Israel lobbying group AIPAC. Tomorrow also marks the first test this election cycle for the progressive message in a decidedly purple swing state. El-Sayed's backers say Michigan's battleground status doesn't mean he can't win in November. And speaking with my colleague Kristen Welker, Senator Bernie Sanders saying he believes the progressive message resonates with more than just progressive Democrats.
Part of the exasperation that the American people are feeling, it's not just an economy which is rigged. They're looking at a corrupt, underlying corrupt campaign finance system. You got billionaires buying elections, government working for the billionaires, and ordinary people saying, we want change. And that is why progressives, democratic socialists are doing so well all over this country. They got an agenda that speaks to the needs of working families. They're prepared to stand up to the oligarchs. It's not just whether Abdul can win or not, beat Haley Stevens. The question is whether or not we live in a democratic society where a candidate fighting for working people can take on tens and tens of millions of dollars of AIPAC money, special interest money.
Senator Sanders is also backing progressive candidates in key House races that have also become proxy battles for the direction of the party, including Michigan's 7th and 13th districts and Missouri's 1st. Where former Congresswoman and progressive so-called squad member Cori Bush is looking for a comeback. Now, back in Michigan, the presumptive Republican nominee in the Senate race, former Congressman Mike Rogers, is looking ahead to the general election, telling Semaphore he's prepared for either Democratic candidate in November, saying, and we're quoting here, common sense over crazy is going to prevail every time. And then Abdul, referring to El-Sayed, just takes it to a new level. And so whoever comes out of this, we're going to win. That's Mike Rogers. And joining me now is our NBC News team on the ground in Michigan. Shaquille Brewster is in Detroit, and Julie Surkin has the latest from Grand Rapids. So, Shaquille, let me start with you. This is the final day of the Michigan primary campaign. What are we expecting from Abdul El-Sayed's closing message ahead of tomorrow?
Well, he's telling voters that he will be the progressive fighter, the progressive candidate in this race. So you'll hear him talk about Medicare for all, for abolishing ICE, ending U.S. military aid to Israel. He's trying to say that he's the outsider in this race, and that will be the message that we'll hear at a rally that he'll have later tonight, and then he'll kick off a canvass launch trying to get those last-minute voters into the polls for Election Day tomorrow. But, Kelly, I'll tell you, I had a conversation with this campaign manager earlier today, and one thing she told me that was striking, she said, quote, Abdul is the front runner in this race. They feel very confident about the momentum that they're coming into Election Day with, but she also noted the spending that he has been facing, saying that that's a historic amount of spending that they would have to overcome if he's successful. She said anything can happen when you talk about the ads that have been put up against him. I was watching television last night, and I did not see any ads supporting him, but I saw a lot of ads supporting Stevens. So that will be something that they're focused on, but this campaign feels very confident that his message of being the outsider, of having campaign finance reform, that will resonate with Michigan voters when they head to the polls tomorrow, Kelly.
What you talked about there, Shaq, reminds me, whenever any of us are on the road, we really get a taste of what voters in a district or a state are getting with all of the attention with advertising. And you can see when it's lopsided like this. You've also been paying attention to another major race in the state, and that's the one to replace the term-limited Governor Gretchen Whitmer. She's a Democrat, of course. You spoke with one of the Republican candidates in that contest, Congressman John James. What is he telling you?
Yeah, Kelly, this is really interesting because John James, he has the support of President Trump. He has his endorsement, but he is also being heavily outspent by his challenger in that race, Perry Johnson, a businessman who's trying to take the more conservative lane in that campaign. Listen to a little bit of our conversation, starting with the influence and the power of the Trump endorsement in a Republican primary here in Michigan.
The president understands how important Michigan is, which is the reason why he trusts me to help make Michigan great again.
For those who might not have supported President Trump, might not support Republicans, what do you say to them, and what are those distinctions that you draw with the president for the general election fight that you may have?
In the state of Michigan, people want to know two things. Are you a good leader, and am I for you? Well, yes, I am for you. I have the leadership to actually deliver in tough environments and circumstances, and my opponents have not had the occasion to develop the skill set to even begin to credibly talk about how they deliver on their promises.
In his last two statewide elections, Congressman James lost those battles, but by closer than expected margins. His main message to folks is that he believes he's the best chance of Republicans flipping Michigan's governor's seat if he wins the primary tomorrow.
It makes it so interesting in Michigan because over time you do see both parties having their moment. And so Republicans might be thinking this is their year. Thank you, Shaq. Julie, I want to turn to you, and you've been following the Haley Stevens campaign. Talk a little bit about her closing message as voters prepare to head to the polls.
Haley, Congresswoman Congresswoman Stevens is going to tell voters she's their Midwestern gal. She's going to be at a brewery about 5 minutes from where I am in downtown Grand Rapids. She represents the suburbs of Detroit. She's in her fourth term in Congress. So voters here know a little bit about her, the fact that she's a little bit more centrist than El Sayed. She's prioritized auto manufacturing, a big industry here in this state. She talks about affordability, pitches her message as somebody who is very anti-Trump. I got a chance to talk to a couple of voters here, and I have to tell you, Kelly, even though school's out, the universities that are typically here are not in session, the young voters were very excited to talk to me about El Sayed, and I think that's where Stevens is going to have the most issues with, getting voters excited, getting Democrats excited to vote for an establishment candidate that does support Israel, that does take AIPAC money. We haven't seen that kind of candidate have a lot of success recently, Kelly, so that'll be really interesting to watch here.
And one of the things that's infusing this race that carries over around the country is this question about, is this really stark progressive message going to play in a state like Michigan? And are there more establishment Democrats that are opening up the possibility of an El Sayed victory? What are you sensing?
I've been so curious and excited to get on the ground here in Michigan, Kelly, especially after covering the primaries in New York City, because we saw progressives really have a great night in New York, but everybody was saying, well, that's New York City. Will that translate to the rest of the country? Now we're in the Midwest, we're in Michigan, and from the conversations that I've had, the conversations that Shaq told you about, certainly seems like voters are more excited about El Sayed. He's a physician, he doesn't have that political background, but when it comes to Stevens, she's made her career by running as somebody positioning herself against the president, who she's really came to power in Congress during the term of, in his first term. So certainly Stevens has a high mountain to climb here, but voters here care about issues like being loud, being bold, being that progressive message, not being afraid to take on the establishment. And Stevens tonight has to make her final pitch here for voters to choose her, for Rogers to go up against her in November and certainly have that chance then. Kelly?
Well, and it's so interesting to hear the Republican in the race talk about being the outsider when he served in Congress for a number of years. So the dynamics are really interesting to watch. We're so glad to have you there on the ground to get a sense of it. Do you get any more of a palpable feeling about voters worried about just the primary, or are they thinking about November too?
They're definitely thinking about November, too. And this isn't the only race, right? I actually had a really interesting conversation, Kelly, with somebody who I asked, you're a Democrat, right? And they said, no, I'm a progressive. And they don't always say that they define themselves with the Democratic Party. I asked if they would definitely support Haley Stevens if she were to beat El Sayed tomorrow, even though El Sayed is their preferred choice. And they said, I don't know. We have to see what kind of candidate she is as it gets closer to November, if she's willing to take on that more progressive route. So this is really not a traditional race by any means. I've been getting that sense as I've traveled around the country, certainly in a place like Michigan. That's going to be notable to watch, not only in the Senate race, but some key House races as well.
So interesting to get that anecdotal sense from talking to real people there, and we'll see how it all pieces together when we start to see results. Thank you, Julie. Glad you're there for us. And of course, the internal tug of war between the Democratic Party's establishment and progressive wing is also playing out in several other key primaries tomorrow night, including in the Kansas governor's race, which Democrats are defending this November. And it won't be easy. President Trump carried Kansas by more than 15 points in 2024. Two state senators, Ethan Corson and Cindy Holscher, as well as Mayor Kurt Skoog of Overland Park, are vying for the Democratic nomination. The term-limited governor, Governor Laura Kelly, has thrown her support behind Corson, while Holscher is winning over more progressive, anti-establishment voters. And joining me now is Kansas State Senator Cindy Holscher. We're so glad that you could be with us. We want to hear from you today. Thank you for making time in the midst of the campaign. So as we kick this off,
thank you so much for having me.
Good. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. So the governor's race is currently rated lean Republican in November by the Cook Political Report. They're tracking all those dynamics. There are far more Republican voters than Democrats in the state. So why do you think you are the best candidate to represent the party, the Democratic Party, in November?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I will tell you this, every race I've had here in Kansas as a red state, I have won in red districts, 4 elections, in fact. And that has required me not only to get Democrats on board with my message, but independents as well as Republicans. So I have a lot of experience in terms of building those coalitions and building that support base that I've needed to win races. And Kansas is still a red state, so that's a very important skill set to bring to this race. And like I said, that's what I've done in 4 races in the past.
I've spent a lot of time in Kansas in cycles past, and I get a sense of what you're talking about there. And Governor Kelly, who you're running to succeed in office, told the New York Times in an interview published today that she believes you've positioned yourself so far to the left at this point that it would be very hard for you to come back from that in a general election. What is your response to that?
You know, the things that I support are things that regular Kansans support. Medicaid expansion, affordable wages, raising the minimum wage, access to affordable health care, child care, and ensuring that we reduce the property taxes here across the state, and legalizing cannabis. All of those things have approval ratings of 70% or greater in terms of where the people feel about it. And the other thing, I've issued a call for a moratorium on data centers. I believe the latest figures show that at least 70% of our population is in favor of that. And those are things where I am in terms of my support and my position. So really, these aren't extreme positions. These are very mainstream positions, even right here in Kansas.
I hear you on that, and I think some of those are quite different than the slate of core issues that you might find in another state, and it does reflect the redder tinge of Kansas. But do you think there are independent voters that you're looking to win over, as opposed to the most conservative, down-the-ticket Republican voters to try to build your coalition in the fall?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I will tell you, what we are seeing across Kansas is that people want us as the legislature and the state government to focus on affordability issues. And that's what I've always been doing, working on initiatives, working on policies that make life more affordable for Kansans. And they are tired of the culture wars, and they are tired of the establishment. And we've also seen over the past few years the tendency of this government to focus on giveaways for billionaires and corporations. And Kansans are extremely fatigued of that and want to make sure that our core services are funded, as well as our public schools. And like I said, that's where so much of the focus is right now. And that goes across party structure, whether it be Republican, Democrat, or independent.
I spoke last week with another candidate who represents one of the most left-wing corners of the party right now, Francesca Hong. She's also running for governor in Wisconsin, and she describes herself as a Democratic socialist. Do you think there is room in the Democratic Party, as you understand it, for people who identify as Democratic socialists?
You know, whatever the label is, you know, and it seems to vary from region to region and state to state. Again, in Kansas, my views and the things I'm supporting aren't necessarily progressive. It's mainstream in terms of what the people want. And that's what I'm fighting for. I'm the only person in this race that comes from a farm, from a military family, as well as a union family. I'm the most successful Democrat in the Senate in terms of getting bills implemented and actually work to end the disastrous Brownback experiment. So I've got the ability to get things done. But like I said, whatever the label, and again, that seems to vary from region to region, this is very mainstream in terms of what Kansans are wanting.
I want to pick up on something you said. You mentioned data centers, and that's an issue in your race, and it's really becoming one all across the country, something we didn't see not long ago. And you want a moratorium on building them, and you voted for a bill that seems to suggest something else. Last year, voting to expand data center construction and give tax breaks to developers. So why the change, and what has moved you from a position of supporting them and the jobs they create in your state to now being in favor of a moratorium?
Yeah, so gosh, 15 months ago, we were brought this bill that painted a picture of great jobs that would come to the area in terms of once the data center was built, as well as construction jobs. And it was painted really as an economic boom. And that sounded great, of course. And as a leader in the state, I feel we should be willing to explore, economic potential. So like I said, that's what was painted for us in terms of what this could do. But what we have seen in the time frame since is something very different. We are seeing these hyperscale data centers come into communities that are sucking up water, jacking up utility rates, and often leaving the taxpayer with a huge burden. Additionally, the jobs just haven't manifested. And at times, even the construction jobs go to crews brought in from out of state that are affiliated with the technology companies. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that we have the guardrails in place to protect our resources, to ensure local jobs with livable wages. And the
so
thing
do you
is,
regret your
again,
earlier
I want
vote?
to be if I had the same information now that I had then, I would certainly vote differently. But the information and the feedback from constituents, this wasn't even on their radar last year. But this year, it's what I'm hearing at every single stop I've made on the campaign trail.
Well, that's interesting that you're actually hearing it from voters. Another thing that we mentioned as we introduced you is the prominence of President Trump and the support he had in your state. And your main rival, Ethan Corson, has made his campaign about standing up to President Trump. And you have not done that as much, or at least not to our knowledge. Why has that not been your focus? And if you were to win the nomination, would you expect to make your race more about the president in the general?
Oh, you know what? Maybe I haven't been talking as much about standing up to Trump, but I've absolutely been doing it. Every bill that has come to us on the Senate floor that is one of those punitive policies from the Trump level, from the federal level, I have stood up against. And that includes bills like giving ICE more power in our state and to adopt what Trump and ICE are doing on the federal level. And I'm the only one in this race that has stood up publicly and stood up on the Senate floor to push back against bills like that. Additionally, I've gone out into the communities. When ICE was threatening to raid a Boys and Girls Club in my community, I joined with neighbors and stood outside of that Boys and Girls Club for over 3 hours, acting as a human deterrent. I'm going to pull every lever. I'm going to push back every way I can to stop these horrible policies that are coming to us from the Trump administration. And that's what I've been doing over the past 10 years.
We so appreciate your time today, and we wish you and all the candidates well in when you go before the voters. So, State Senator Cindy Holscher, thank you so much for your time, and we appreciate it. And we'll be watching your race to see how it all turns out. And speaking of the big election, we want to promote our election coverage for tomorrow night. The candidates will be doing what they do, and we will be bringing you a report with our colleagues Kristen Welker, Hallie Jackson, Steve Kornacki, and the host of political reporters who are covering all of the primary results as they come in. It kicks off at 9 p.m. Eastern, and we hope you will be part of that. And coming up, wartime uncertainty. President Trump says he canceled strikes against Iran because of renewed peace talks as he threatens, quote, decapitation of Tehran. Plus, choice words. President Trump rebukes longtime ally Jeanine Pirro, blasting her decision to drop a reflecting pool vandalism case as her office reversed itself to say the damage was caused by a botched installation.
And I was disappointed with Jeanine Pirro, really disappointed with Jeanine Pirro. She folded like an umbrella.
Welcome back. President Trump is once again walking back from the brink of escalation with Iran, calling off the latest round of strikes and saying new talks with Tehran are beginning today. But Iran's foreign ministry saying there are no talks taking place with the U.S. Despite that, this afternoon, President Trump doubling down on his claim that talks are ongoing.
We're in talks, and they'll sometimes deny it, even though they spend hours and hours together talking. No, the talks are going along. This is the last chance. This is not something that, if it doesn't happen, this is the last chance for them to sign a good document. I want to give them every last chance before decapitation. Very tough to do what we have planned, still planned. We'll see what happens. But it's a very, very tough thing to do. I think I'm very proud of the fact that I'll give people a chance. This is a big move. To do an attack that big on a country, I'd rather not do it.
On multiple occasions throughout this war, President Trump has gone back and forth between threatening massive military strikes and announcing a diplomatic breakthrough. Back in April, he warned Iran that its, quote, whole civilization will die tonight. And then less than 12 hours later came with this announcement. He was suspending the bombings because he'd received a, quote, workable proposal from Iran. Similarly, in June, President Trump said the U.S. would be hitting Iran very hard and taking over Karg Island, Iran's main oil export hub. But then hours later, canceling those strikes, saying negotiations with Tehran have been brought to the highest level of Iranian leadership and have been approved. That memorandum of understanding that fell apart last month. So joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Yamiche El-Sindor and NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons. Welcome to both of you. We've both been on that ride up and down with these various iterations. Yamiche, let me start with you. What do we know about this instance of the president's decision-making to back down from his latest threat against Iran?
Well, Kelly, this has really just been a whirlwind of information that's really gone on for the last 24 hours. I've been pushing White House officials today to ask and to explain to me why the president backed down from what he said was going to be this massive attack, bigger than World War II, he said, against Iran, and also why the president is continuing to say that he's having talks with Iran when Iran is denying that. And this White House continues to say, look, listen to what the president's saying. So the president is essentially calling out Iran and claiming that they're just spreading false information. But as you know, the Iranian foreign minister has been very clear. He said they're only negotiating with Oman and that there are no negotiations. His word, there are no negotiations with Americans. The other thing to note here is that President Trump is already claiming that the United States has control of the Strait of Hormuz when everyone else around the country and around the world is essentially saying that's not quite right. But with the president claiming that and with Iran essentially saying that we're just talking directly with Oman, with Iran saying they're just talking directly with Oman, it's really hard to understand what the end game looks like here. The president also has not said if there's a deadline to these talks, which I think is a key part of this, because there is this sort of clock and you have a back and forth like this. The natural question is, well, how long is this going to go on? And the president says there is no deadline because he doesn't want to see people die. So at the same time that he's making these threats, he's saying he doesn't actually want to fall through or go through with these threats, Kelly.
And to just add a little more to that, he also said that there are, quote, perimeters of a deal. He may have meant parameters. Do we have any clarity in what that might look like and how it could be different from the memorandum of understanding that he signed with all that flair at Versailles last month?
The short answer is no, because if the Iranians continue to say what they're saying, which is that there are no negotiations, it's hard to say that there's a parameter of a deal, a perimeter of a deal, or any sort of deal, any kind of thing going on because of the way that these messages are going. That being said, it'll be very interesting to see if maybe after this, if there was some back channeling going on. And of course, the Iranians, there are a number of experts that would say take them with a grain of salt on their messaging along with President Trump. So I think it'll be very interesting to watch how all this plays out, even as these stark messages continue to be complete opposites of each other, Kelly.
Thank you, Yamiche. Let's hear how it's playing in the region. Keir, President Trump said he was asked by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar to hold off on the strikes. What do we know more from the Gulf side of this on the role of those countries in trying to de-escalate?
Well, certainly Saudi Arabia has said that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, did phone President Trump and ask him to stand down, to not launch these massive strikes. I mean, you can't really underestimate the impact that there would have been. And we were hours away over the weekend, by the president's account, from the strikes that he described, as you say, as the biggest since World War II. I mean, what that means, clearly, you judge for yourself, but certainly strikes of a substantial nature. And in that news conference today, where you played the sound, where he talked about decapitation, sounds as if one of the plans would have been to launch another attack on the leadership of Iran, maybe with the thought that it wasn't working, negotiating with those leaders, try and bring in new leaders. So that will have worried this region very much too, because while there are real concerns in countries like Qatar here and the UAE and all of these countries that surround Iran and that are partners and allies of America, while there are concerns about a strengthened Iran, there are also concerns about a collapsing Iran. It is a very, very difficult situation and a very dangerous one.
And when you talk about the sense, and you have a lot of source conversations I know you have with leaders and diplomats in the region, how do they process the up and down of the president's, the way that he talks about this and how he makes the threat and pulls back from the threat? Are they sort of on the same ride with us, or do they interpret it somehow differently based on their worldview and their life experience?
Well, yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, you will hear people here say, we encouraged the US not to do this, not to launch this war, and it did it, and now look where we are. And on the other hand, you'll also hear them blame Iran, because it should be noted that after that memorandum of understanding, Iran started firing on ships when it thought that point 5 of that memorandum, which is about the Strait of Hormuz, wasn't being followed through. So there's a lot of blame to go around here, and a lot of worry and a lot of concern. But I think one of the other aspects of all of this, though, too, and you can't, again, it's changing this region, but one of the other aspects of all of this is a sense that where do you end up after all of this, particularly if America walks away?
Keir, thank you so much for that. And obviously the countries you're reporting on there have a lot at stake because they have been targeted by Iran. It is not theoretical to them. Thank you so much for your reporting, and thank you to Yamiche as well. And up next, live on Capitol Hill with new developments surrounding the fate of Todd Blanche's nomination to become the permanent U.S. Attorney General. This is Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche appears to be on a glide path toward confirmation after announcing last night that he reached a deal with key Republicans, officially rescinding the so-called DOJ's anti-weaponization fund and limiting the scope of the IRS audit immunity deal for the president, his family, and businesses. The two top Republican holdouts, Senators John Cornyn and Thom Tillis, saying today in a joint statement this morning that they were very pleased with a formal order terminating the fund, and they look forward to advancing his nomination out of the Judiciary Committee. Despite that, today President Trump continued to insist the DOJ fund is very popular.
I view that fund as a positive, and a lot of Republicans do too, not so many Democrats. And it's not only for that, it's for other things too. People that have been treated unfairly, that have been weaponized by a corrupt government.
Did you sign off on Todd Blanche?
I didn't look at it. All I know is that Todd Blanche is great. He's going to do a great job. Everybody knows it. And I understand there's been a sign-off. But I don't know what they agreed. I think Todd Blanche agreed to reconfirm things that he's already said. And what he said was okay.
Joining me now is NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor. Now, I am struck by that, Sahil, that he is a party to this, and yet he didn't look at it, didn't read it, thinks that there's been a sign-off. The Attorney General may have reached this deal with Senators Cornyn and Tillis, but from your reporting, is this order binding?
It's a good question, Kelly, because this is currently official DOJ policy, but could it be reversed and superseded by a new official DOJ policy? It's hard to take that off the table, given that Todd Blanche, now and if and when he's confirmed as AG, still answers to President Trump ultimately. And we've seen Trump repeatedly defend this fund. It's not exactly what these two men, Cornyn and Tillis, wanted, which is a rewritten settlement in court signed by all the relevant parties, which cannot be toyed with. Nevertheless, they say they're satisfied by what they see as an order to terminate this weaponization fund. They don't expect it to come back. What Tillis told me a month and a half ago is that he wants this fund dead, 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 in his own words. I think it's fair to say that this order puts it in a coma. Can it wake up? I think time will tell.
Well, that certainly gives me a mental picture for all of this. The other piece of it is the immunity for the IRS protections, that the family, the president would have some ability to have protection from being audited, which could save them money. It could provide them a financial windfall. This deal doesn't really address that, but the deal does say that what Blanche testified to, that it would be retroactive and not forward-looking. Is that going to be satisfactory enough to these senators and others who have really also expressed worries about that?
Well, these Republican senators have not said that that's a red line to vote against Todd Blanche. They may have their opinions on it, but there's no indication right now that in committee tomorrow, which is a breakdown of 12 Republicans, 10 Democrats, that's going to stop Blanche from ultimately getting the votes. Democrats are up in arms about this. They say it does not do anything to affect that tax audit settlement that, in the views of some Democrats, allows the president to evade taxes that he should owe on several $1 billion. So that's going to be a recurring issue. But is it going to stop Todd Blanche from being confirmed by Senate Republicans? Doesn't look like it to me.
So key vote tomorrow, getting him out of the committee. They're up against their August break. Give us the timeline of when we expect this might proceed.
Short answer is likely on Saturday, Kelly. We should expect a final vote in the Senate. What's going to happen is tomorrow, the Judiciary Committee is likely to vote him out. Then the following day, on Wednesday, John Thune, the majority leader, is going to begin the process of cloture on the Senate floor. Intervening day, procedural vote on Friday, and then final vote on Saturday. All of this can be cut short, as you well know, if there's unanimous consent in the Senate. Something tells me that Democrats are not going to be in a mood to consent to speeding this one up.
Oh, I think you're right about that. I don't think they want to move this faster. There is a separate topic I wanted to touch on with you. That is the Senate Appropriations Committee coming together on a deal to fund the government so it's not at issue during the midterm elections. What is the new timeline and what's in that bill?
That's right. So there's an agreement here in the Senate that just about everyone wants to take the threat of a government shutdown off the table. That would happen starting October 1st if there's no action by Congress. But what they've agreed to, in the absence of a long-term appropriations deal to fund the government for the next fiscal year, is a stopgap bill, a continuing resolution that keeps existing funds flowing on autopilot through December 11th. Now, it's not identical to the version that the House passed. It's got some new additions in here, including a provision that restricts the White House Budget Office's ability to cancel grants to blue states that didn't vote for President Trump, which is something that the administration remarkably admitted to doing in court. Other than that, it's largely status quo. December 11th, after the midterms, they come back and they hash it out. Kelly.
That's an interesting detail about restricting money for blue states. Sahil, thank you so much. I know you'll have a busy week following all of that. And after the break, we'll talk about the defiance of an Ohio Republican congressman, Max Miller, who denies accusations of domestic abuse and rejects calls to drop his bid for re-election. We'll dig into the fallout. Keep it here on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning now to Ohio, where allegations of domestic abuse are roiling a top Republican's re-election campaign. A defiant Ohio Congressman, Max Miller, denying troubling accusations.
I categorically deny abusing my former wife.
The 37-year-old Republican and divorced father embroiled in a family crisis, taking to social media to push back. Miller is running for re-election to a third term in Congress. In a live stream Sunday, he spoke directly to voters, disputing a string of specific allegations of domestic abuse.
So ask yourself, if I had assaulted her, Would she had offered to cook me dinner 6 days later?
His ex-wife, Emily Moreno, has said he may have been responsible for their toddler's broken collarbone, but no charges were brought against him.
I have never abused our daughter.
According to police reports, Moreno also said that Miller scalded her with hot water. His response?
It was horseplay in our kitchen. I sprayed water at her from the sprayer attached to our kitchen sink tap water, which does not reach boiling temperature or scalding.
The congressman said his former wife, the daughter of Republican Senator Bernie Moreno of Ohio, has struggled with significant mental health issues. The senator going public Sunday, describing the last 2 years as pure hell, and he called on Miller to step down, writing on social media, "He is a danger to my daughter, and I hold my breath every minute he has custody of my granddaughter." If there are any basic standards of character required to hold elected office, Max Miller fails them. On Air Force One, President Trump, who has endorsed Miller, was asked if the congressman should resign.
Well, I'm going to look at it. I mean, so far it's accusations. I'll be looking at it.
And joining me now with this challenging topic is our panel, Julia Manchester, White House correspondent for The Hill, Mo Alethe, Democratic strategist and executive director at the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service, and Stephen Hayes, editor and CEO of The Dispatch. He's also an NBC News political analyst. And Julia, let me start with you. We have not seen a number of prominent leadership Republicans. The president has talked about it, but has not said that Miller should exit the race, or they haven't commented on some of that. Why do you think that is? What are the dynamics?
Well, look, it's a tricky situation for Republicans because it's inter-party battle, obviously, you know, an inter-family issue here. You have Bernie Moreno calling on Max Miller to resign, Max Miller pushing back against that. I think it's interesting, though, listening to President Trump today, just within the last hour, him saying, almost praising Miller, saying, for the longest time thought he was a good person. We'll be looking at it. It's a very sad situation. But look, watching that video that Max Miller put out yesterday after his former father-in-law called on him to resign, I think was pretty, it struck me in many ways. He's doing a lot of explaining. And I think at this point, you don't want to have to be doing that explaining about domestic assault or abuse allegations.
Tough topics, for sure. And Steve, NBC was talking to residents in Miller's district today in Ohio about these allegations. I want to play some of what they had to say, and then we can talk about it. Let's listen to them.
Do you think he should stay in or drop out?
Oh, no, I think he should definitely stay in.
I think he should run no matter what. It shouldn't matter what somebody else is saying unless it's a proven fact that that's what he did.
If he wants to stay in, I think we should vote him out. I mean, it's up to us as the voters to speak with our votes.
Steve, you and I are old enough to remember even a hint of allegation could be enough to disqualify someone. We're in a different time now. He is denying these allegations vigorously and talking about that. It has been something that this family's gone through for a couple of years, with difficult issues of the divorce and custody and all of that. Where does this land in the political sense of, are Republicans going to rally around him? Is there anything they can do? The deadline for him to leave the race is Wednesday, but he is duly elected as the nominee of his party.
Yeah, I suspect that they will do what they've done a lot over the past decade, which is defer to Donald Trump. And you heard that Donald Trump seems reluctant to cast Max Miller aside. He worked in the Trump White House. Donald Trump thinks he knows him. But these are very serious allegations, and they don't just come from his wife. One of his former colleagues at the White House had also accused him of abuse. So if you find the allegations compelling, there's a pattern here. And that'll be problematic as you push forward towards November and what is likely to be a very competitive, it's a competitive district. It's one of the districts that Democrats could conceivably win, certainly in a blue wave year, if that's in fact what happens. And these allegations, I think, will be very difficult for him to push back on.
And Mo, that leads me to you. Miller is saying he's going to stay in the race. He's saying he's going to win. But it was a seat that he won with just over 51% of the vote. He's seeking his third term. He's from a very prominent family, not just the Moreno side, but his own family, very prominent in this area. What do you think the chances are for Democrats to be victorious here? Is this the kind of issue that can do it?
Well, I think I've stopped making predictions of politics a long time ago. But I do think that if he remains in as the nominee, Democrats do see this as a competitive seat. I think they saw it as a competitive seat before.
Sure.
And now with this, it takes it to a different level. We just went through this on our side of the aisle with Graham Plattner. And while my party was slow to get there, they did get there. If Republicans look the other way and allow him, while there is still time, not much, but there is still a couple of days where they could replace him on the ballot, if they look the other way, I mean, that video in and of itself, that clip that we played in and of itself, it's a campaign ad in waiting. I don't know how well that goes over when he says, you know, if I had abused her, would she have still cooked me dinner? I think there are a lot of women out there, especially.
And it was a lengthy live stream where he was going point by point talking about it. So those who did view it will have a chance to kind of assess with their own experience. Let me turn to another topic, and I'll come back to you, Julia. We have seen how now the president and the media company, his social media platform, Truth Social, is allowing financial firms and organizations to buy advance access to his posts. And at the same time, I've been covering this White House in both terms long enough to have heard Caroline Leavitt and many others to say that the post from the president is government policy. And now they're monetizing that and putting it behind a paywall, giving certain outlets that would pay $100,000 a month access to this in advance. How is this playing as a story? Is it even breaking through in terms of the questions it raises about ethical conduct?
It certainly is. I think right now in this news cycle and how many stories there are with the Iran war, et cetera, it's not necessarily a top story. But when you have the White House press office referring us every day as reporters to President Trump's Truth Social posts, while at the same time, when we ask about that company, about the Trump organization, the business side of it, they say, well, that's separate from the White House. That just confuses me a bit. It seems like this is another example of the lines really being blurred between the official Trump White House and the Trump organization. And I think the White House is going to continue to be pressed on sort of those blurred lines and if there's going to be really a differentiation there.
And his posts can move markets, and sometimes they look like they were scheduled in such a way. Is this going to be something that Republicans are going to accept?
Yeah, I think probably so. I mean, look, this is just rank corruption. I mean, that's what it is. And one of the things that we've talked about here and over the past decade is that Donald Trump is sometimes able to get away with the things he's able to get away with because he does them in the open. He's not hiding this. I mean, that's what this is. He's basically making a profit on his word being policy, as you point out, and moving markets. And you have companies that are not only going to feel like they want to take advantage of it, they're going to feel like they have an obligation to be competitive in a marketplace to pay to access that. It's just rank corruption.
That competitive thing that does draw them in, even if they would be otherwise uncomfortable, really is a dynamic we see again and again with donations to the ballroom or other things. Yes. And do you see this as being an issue that even breaks through, or is it just part of a broader piece where people raise concerns about the profiting of the presidency?
It's the latest data point, and what I think is a message Democrats are really coalescing around, which is Donald Trump promised that he was going to make your life easier, that he was going to put more money in your pockets, and the only pockets that are heavier today are his. That he is not taking care of your priorities, he is enriching himself. And that message of Democrats continue. Every day he's giving them more ammo to drive home that message.
According to his financial disclosure, he earned more in office than he had in many years of his career. So that's an interesting thing too. Before I let you go, we've got to talk midterms for just a moment. What do you think is the main thing to be watching tomorrow in the primaries? Is it this divide within the Democratic Party? Is it a particular candidate? What stands out to you?
Well, I guess, look, Michigan is obviously the state to watch in that Senate race in Michigan. And really, you know, who comes out of that? It's the divide within the Democratic Party. You know, President Trump said earlier today, well, it's a communist running against a socialist, him labeling Abdullah el-Sayed as the communist and Haley Stevens as a socialist. So they're going to have that label no matter what. But Republicans I talk to say if they had to pick a candidate to run against, it would be Abdul el-Sayed. So, you know, if he wins, and there's polling that suggests that's very possible, he's going to have a very uphill climb against someone like Mike Rogers, who has really presented himself in the past as a bit of a moderate.
And he is also sort of packaging himself as the outsider, even though he'd been in Congress, he'd been an FBI agent. Is that going to work for voters, that Mike Rogers is the outsider?
You know, I don't know that he's the outsider, but what I think he's done, he was never a super MAGA Republican from the beginning. No. Maybe not an outspoken never Trump Republican, but he wasn't on board. He has become more MAGA, as most Republicans do when they're running for office. I think he has enough distance not to have to own everything the president does, which I think gives him an advantage in a divided electorate and probably a pretty bad year for Republicans. But Abdul El-Sayed has said some pretty radical things, and he's embraced some pretty radical people. His association with Hassan Piker, his unapologetic association with Hassan Piker, who has said America deserves 9/11, who posted on the wall behind his podcasting studio the front page of the New York Times the day after that attack. And the fact that Abdul El-Sayed won't back away and takes it as sort of a point of pride to embrace Hassan Piker, I think is rich for Republicans.
I am out of time. Do you have one last thought quickly?
The coalition of whoever wins this race, the coalition is going to be the thing to watch. So far, the DSA wing of the party has been propelled primarily by wealthier white elites, whereas the working class has and black voters and some of the bedrocks of the old Democratic coalition, we'll see which one prevails tomorrow.
Thank you all for your smart thoughts and insights, and we will certainly be watching to see how it all plays out. We want to turn now to some other news involving Democratic Ohio Representative Marcy Kaptur. The 80-year-old Congresswoman was hospitalized following a hit-and-run crash Sunday morning. In a statement, Kaptur's office says she was on her way to church services in the Toledo area when the car she was a passenger in was struck. The Congresswoman is active and alert and being treated for non-life-threatening injuries. We certainly send our best to her. In a Sunday evening update, the Toledo Police Department confirmed that the second person in the car was Kaptur's campaign manager. Both individuals are recovering in the hospital and are in stable condition. A police investigation is ongoing. Kaptur, who is up for re-election in November, is currently in her 17th term in Congress and is one of the longest-serving members of the House. We will be right back with more Meet the Press Now. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Justice Department is dropping its case against former Olympic canoeist David Hearn after accusing him of vandalizing the reflecting pool. While speaking in the Oval Office today, President Trump lashing out at U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Jeanine Pirro, saying she made a mistake.
Jeanine Pirro made a mistake. There was vandalism. Now, I'm not saying I was 100% thrilled with the contractor, but the contractor was rushing. We wanted to get it open for July 4th, and we got it done. But in addition, there was vandalism. I was disappointed with Jeanine Pirro, really disappointed with Jeanine Pirro. She folded like an umbrella, and people get away with things, and it's a disgrace.
Pirro previously claimed she had tremendous evidence against Mr. Hearn, but on Friday, her office said it obtained new information showing the damage was the result of a, quote, botched installation and not vandalism. Joining me now is NBC News legal affairs reporter Gary Grumbach. Gary, you and I have both been talking about this case a lot. Walk us through it. Why did she drop it? And obviously there will be some repercussions from the White House, it would appear, at least in mood, if not in actually anything substantive.
So for prosecutors to bring a charge, Kelly, they need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And it's very clear here, Jeanine Pirro said it herself, there was not enough proof there to actually charge David Hearn with causing more than $1,000 in damage to the reflecting pool. And she
felony.
A felony, that's correct, here in the District of Columbia. She says her office received more than 700 megabytes of data, pictures of information from the Department of Interior after this indictment was brought against David Hearn that led them to believe that, oh, this was just damage caused by Atlantic Industrial Coatings, which is the company that is working on the reflecting pool right now, that it was caused a botched effort and it was a rushed effort as well, Kelly.
Other people have also been charged. Where does that stand?
So there were 3 other individuals other than David Hearn that were charged with misdemeanors here in the district, local crimes. Those have all been dismissed out of hand as well. They did not have enough evidence for those folks either, Kelly.
Well, we will be waiting for further reflections on the reflecting pool. Thank you, Gary. We so appreciate it. We're back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, and there's more ahead on NBC News Now. Stay right here.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.